Okay, so when you first open Blender, because of the environment I've created, you can just go ahead and start drawing. So I'm going to draw this character of the type that my son might draw. Okay, so now the question is, how did you determine that you're drawing with a marker or pencil or brush or something that appears to be red? Well, why is that? Here's your tools right over here. Okay, so right now I'm using the draw tool. You could use the fill tool, which would of course result in a fill of the entire drawing region. Well, the fill, as you can see, this is unusual, it makes Blender different, is that the fill is limited to the region that you can see. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We could get into why, but the more important question would probably be, if you hit the fill tool, why did it not fill? Why did it only draw a line? Okay, so let's address that. The reason is that any material that you use in Blender to draw with or fill or whatever is over here in the palette of materials. Okay, so here you have a list of materials that I've given, I would say, somewhat intelligent names to. The ones here at the bottom are just basic generic colors that you can tweak and customize. So when I did the fill operation, the reason it didn't fill the whole space but only made the outline is that this particular color that I'm drawing with does not have a fill characteristic. Any material has either a stroke or a fill or both. And any changes you make to this propagate to the drawings that you did previously. So if I went ahead and took my red pencil that I've been drawing with and I gave it a fill characteristic, all right, we turn up the alpha, which is the transparency. We turn that up to 1, and then drag this up here, and you can see that all the strokes that I drew are now filled. So generally the simplest way to, if you're just drawing or inking, you really don't want your material to have a fill characteristic. So you just turn that off and you're back to where we were. Okay. So in other words, if I grabbed my charcoal ink, then I would get black. If I grab material 2 down here, I get a black outline, which isn't because I'd have to turn the radius of the brush up to really be able to see it. But if I turn the stroke on, sorry about that. Hello, stroke, boom. If I turn the stroke on, now I can see it, so it's both stroked and filled. Okay, so now a question that might come up is, well, okay, but if I was going to use a material to make some closed shapes or something, I probably wouldn't want it to have this sort of half-transparent characteristic to it. So now the question becomes, well, why is it transparent? Well, if we look down here in the material, the first thing we might suspect is that maybe the stroke is not fully opaque. But we see here that it is. Okay, if I turn this down, you can see the alpha is being turned up and down. So it is fully opaque. So then why this semi-transparency? Well, the reason is right here. These are your brush, let's just say characteristics, right here. This little toolbar up here. And I'm going to go back to this material. And this little icon right here is to make this characteristic respond to pressure. So the two basic characteristics of the brush are the radius, which is how big it is, and the strength, which is how opaque it is. So if I was going to use this material and I want it to be fully black on the stroke, I would turn pressure off. And I'd leave the strength at 1, which is 100%. So that way, the next one I draw, boom, now you can see it's a fully opaque stroke, not responding to pressure, but as you can see by pressing hard, the radius is responding to pressure. If I turn this off, then every stroke would be the same width. So those are the basic characteristics of the brushes. There are some other options you can explore. The main ones that might be interesting would be options. Mainly you've got this stuff up here, which results in smoothing, and then this stuff down here which results in randomness. So if I turn on randomize, for example, and map it to pressure, then the harder I press, the more the line it'll become noisy. Okay. Let's turn the fill off so we can see it better. Okay. Now, like I said, you can play around with this post-processing. This is actually kind of funny because I introduced the noise, but I also had the post-processing smoothing option turned on. So if I want to get the randomizing, let's turn up jitter. And jitter, as you can see by this icon, is also mapped to pressure. But let's turn this post-processing smoothing off, because that's why it smoothed back out, is because of a post-processing smoothing. Now I just get all this noise. If I don't press very hard, let's turn pressure back on here so that I can have a thinner line. And then the harder I press, the more noise I get. So, all right, so now let's get back. Those are the basic characteristics of a brush. So you can see it is not a bitmap type painting tool like Krita is. So now I hit undo a bunch of times, and I actually exceeded the number of steps of undo that I have set up in the preferences. So now the question would be, well, how do I get rid of these items right here? There's a couple ways. One would be to use erasing. So right now I'm in draw mode, but if I hit control, I'm actually erasing the strokes, which, as you can see, erases the fill as well. If I do the same type of erasing on a stroke that isn't filled, then it acts more like you would expect an eraser to behave. Hopefully that makes sense. I can also hit Control-Alt and drag a lasso around some strokes, and it just erases them completely. So now I'm going to go back to my red pencil, which, by the way, right now has a ridiculously high radius. So if I hit Control and click there, I can change this back to, I'm going to change it to 20. And now it's pretty close to what I had when I started. So here's my character. And now we say, well, we want to ink it. Let's say we want to go ahead and add some ink. Okay. Normally what I would do is I would switch to the charcoal ink material, because that's basically black. You can see right here it does not have a fill. It only has a stroke. So again, we're dealing with just lines. We're dealing with a brush that draws lines as opposed to creates closed shapes. But I don't necessarily like my sketch pencil for that purpose. So I'm going to switch right here. We can switch the type of draw tool we're using. And these can all be customized. You can create your own, but for now we'll just work with the preset ones because they give us a pretty good selection of tools to work with. And I'm going to choose Draw Ink. Okay? Now, the Draw Ink, this is a brush that I created, and you'll notice in the options that it has active smoothing on. And what that does, and it's actually got a little bit of post-processing smoothing, but you could actually turn that off and you'd still get the effect. When I draw, you'll notice it kind of lags behind, but it smooths the lines for me. Okay, so I like this for anime type inking. You could certainly turn off the active smoothing, which means that if I zoom in, and by the way, you're going to say, well, how do you zoom in? What you do is you hit Control, and then you hit your middle mouse button on your stylus. So the way I've got Blender set up, if I just press my middle mouse button, I can pan, and if I hit Control and middle mouse, I can zoom. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control and just draw, which is going to erase this line. Or if I'm in a hurry, I can hit Control-Alt, put a lasso around it, and get rid of it completely. So now we say, well, we want a bigger radius so that we can have more of a traditional inking brush. Okay, now right now I'm going to look at my curves because I'm just thinking about this in terms of how you might want to customize it. You might want it to start thinner. You might want to have a wider range of thinnest to thickest. And the way I would do that is to go into the curves, and I'm going to look at my curves for sensitivity. Sensitivity is what affects the radius for the most part. So I'm going to make this more of a concave sort of curve, which means that I'm going to have a thinner line, but I'm going to have to press pretty hard to get it to start to jump up here. It's not a linear relationship between my pressure. Like this would be linear. Let's see what happens if we make it more logarithmic. Okay, so you can see now that gives you the flexibility to also crank the radius up even higher, and you can still get quite a lot of variety in your lines. So that's what the curves are for. It just gives you more control. All right, so now I'm going to hit Control Alt, draw a lasso around this. And now when I go to ink my character, I want to have the ability to just delete my pencil test later. So what I do is in the Blender grease pencil, or in Blender I guess we'd say, for you everything you're experiencing with Blender is basically the grease pencil, which is the tool we're using for 2D animation. We've got these layers. So these are your layers as you would, as you're familiar with layers in other programs. So these down here are the palette of colors. This up here is the group of layers. So I created these basic set of layers that I found I would want to use for the type of work we're going to be doing. So what I'm going to do is switch to the lines. Well, you could call it ink. If you want to call it ink, just double click it and change the name. Okay, we'll call this our ink layer. I'm using the draw ink brush. I'm going to turn the radius down to, let's say, 30. I'm going to keep the curves. Actually, since I did what I did with the curves, I'm going to go ahead and rethink that. Let's make that 60. Okay. We don't want any pressure on our strength, because if we have pressure on the strength, then we run the risk of, let me see if I can get this. And it looks like what I was trying to illustrate, I'm not going to be able to illustrate with this particular brush, so it's not that important. But what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the active smoothing back up. I had it at 0.8, so let's get it close to that. And that way, when I draw a line, Blender's just going to kind of smooth it out for me quite nicely. All right. So now I'm going to ink my character. Like so. Okay. And you say, well, wait a minute. I think for the eyes, isn't there a way to make a real proper circle? Well, there is. That's what these tools here are for. All right. So let's look at those real quick. If you want to make a circle, just grab the circle tool, and you see that the circle, you see two things. One is the thickness of it is way too thick, and also what are all these little dots? Well, the dots give you the ability to manipulate it and change it before you commit to it. If you hit the enter key, now you've committed to it. The problem of the radius of the circle itself is really because we've got this turned up so high with our brush. So this is probably going to be a little closer. And by the way, it's making an ellipse. If I want it to be an exact circle, I hit shift while I'm dragging. Okay. So let's just be happy with that, and now we'll do another one. Okay. So now we have a new problem. And the new problem is we didn't get that circle exactly where we want it. So this is where Blender begins to differ from Krita or other bitmap type programs, because it really behaves more like a vector drawing program. Here's how. There are actually 3 modes of operation in Blender. Okay? There's object mode, edit mode, and draw mode. And I'll get into how to switch between them shortly. When we first started Blender, because of the way I have it set up, you're automatically in draw mode to start. So you can just start drawing and be productive. Okay. Now, let me do a couple things. First of all, I'm going to pan the view like this. Wait, how did you pan the view? I'm panning the view with my middle mouse button on my stylus. I'm just pressing middle mouse button and I can pan the view around. If I hit Control and the middle mouse button, I can zoom in and out. So that gives you the ability to get around in your canvas, as it were. Now the problem that we had was that his eye is in the wrong place. Okay? What you want to realize is that everything you're drawing in Blender actually consists of points that are connected. Okay? And the only way you see that is to go into edit mode. So I'm going to jump out of draw mode into edit mode. And the way I do that is with, with the tab key. You use the tab key to jump out of draw mode into edit mode. So I hit the tab key and now I'm in edit mode. Alright, now if I grab some points, you can see some pretty interesting things happening. Whether this is desirable or not depends on what you're trying to do. But there's a few things you want to be aware of. What we want to do is we want to grab a point that's in this circle we created, but we want to grab all the points. Okay, there's more than one way to do it. One is to hit the L key. In Blender, when you hit the L key, it does what's called select linked. Okay? Select linked means any points that are linked to the current point that you just selected so that they combine together to make a single stroke, which this circle is, grab them all. So the L key is to select all the points that are linked to the point that I just selected. So same thing would happen here. If I grab this and hit L, I've grabbed his whole head. Now the problem we're going to run into immediately now is, well, what about our pencil sketch? I don't want to grab these points. I only want to grab my character. Well, we can solve that in one of two ways. One is we can hit the star key on the numpad on our computer. When we hit the star key on the numpad, I've got Blender set up to do what's called isolating or soloing the current layer. So as you can see, what happens over here is when I hit the star key, the ink layer becomes active, but all the other ones are grayed out because you can see these little padlocks. They're now locked. I cannot accidentally select any of the sketch. Okay, now I'm going to hit the star key again. Another way to accomplish the same thing would be to do the opposite, which is to just lock the sketch layer with the padlock. And by the way, as long as you're over here, you might want to explore these other icons. They are visibility, which would turn off the sketch layer completely so I can't even see it. Onion skins, which is not really relevant until you start animating. I think you know what onion skins are from Krita. And clamp. Clamp is the same as Krita's inherit alpha. So that's why I have a shadow layer here, because later, if we want to give this character shadows and we push the clamp button, we can draw a shadow shape around where we want it to be in shadow, and you'll only see the shadow inside of where the character is filled. So that's quite useful. In fact, my Blender template probably should have that activated by default, truth be known. But I'm going to go back to the ink now. So now what we want to do is we want to grab this point, hit the L key, and then move it around. So we've got good news and bad news. The good news is what you're seeing happening here is kind of cool. I like the fact that I can grab a piece of my character, and actually if I grab it, I'm going to do this with my stylus. If I grab it and you want to grab with your right mouse, that's just a Blender thing. Blender has always preferred the right mouse for selection. Okay? So now you kind of want to think like a 3D person right now. And in 3D, you can do three things with points. You can move them, rotate them, or scale them. All right? So now, if I wanted to grab a selection of points, I could hit the control button and draw a lasso around a certain number of points. Okay? And now if I hit the G key, which you can think of it as go, we're going to go somewhere. G to go. And of course, you could change the keyboard mapping so it's the M key for move or something like that if you want to. But I stick with G just because Blender has used the G key for moving for 20 years and I'm used to it. Okay? So we can also rotate. You'll notice that the points are not rotating around their own center. They're rotating around this little widget right here. Now that's super useful because if I hit the A key to select all the points on my character, and by the way, you can deselect it by hitting A twice really quickly, like that. If I grab all these points and I wanted to animate my character nodding his head, I could actually take this thing, which is called the 3D cursor, and just click right there where his neck would be, and now he's going to rotate around that. Okay? Well, you say, okay, but what if I hit Control and I select these points and I want them to rotate around their natural center? What you do is you hit the period key and you change the rotating, the pivot point, which is what it's called, from the 3D cursor to the median point. Now if it's set to the median point, you see it rotates around its own natural center. No matter how big the selection is that I grabbed, it's going to rotate around its median point. Now an obvious problem that we have is to move this eye. Again, we're going to hit the L key to select linked. If I grab it, we've got this this sort of magnet thing going on where it's dragging all the other points with it, and we don't actually want that in this case. That's right here. Proportional editing mode. Just disable that. I have it on by default because once I go into edit mode and start editing a character, I generally want to be able to have that magnet feature going on. Now if you do leave it on, what you'll find is you hit the G key and then you roll your middle mouse button and you can actually in real time modify the range of influence of it. So just use your middle mouse for that. But for now, we want it off. So let's just disable proportional editing. Again, we're only dealing with features we want to actually use today, okay? So what we do is we right mouse click here and then hit the L key to select linked. And now, because proportional editing is turned off, I hit the G key. I can move this to wherever I want. So you can see that this is pretty powerful because it's very much like a vector drawing type of program where you can grab pieces of it either as complete objects or pieces of the objects, and you can change them after the fact. So that editability is kind of what makes Blender superior to a bitmap based program, because you really can't get the amount of flexibility that you can get with Blender in this regard. Okay, so for example, if I hit Control and drag with the lasso, again in edit mode, you know, I could say, well, I want this guy's ear to be bigger. Now, if you're finding that the scale, so I'm hitting the S key, by the way. So it's R to rotate, S to scale, G to go. All right. So let's just say I wanted to make this guy's ear bigger, but I decided, well, I really do want it to sort of scale nicely with the rest of my character. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enable the proportional editing tool, and I'm also going to put my cursor right there, and I'm going to hit the period key and go back to 3D cursor. Now what's going to happen is it's going to scale away from the cursor. See? Now we do have a little bit of a problem in this case because it's affecting this eye, which we really don't want to do. But if we shrink that range of influence, we can sort of get away with faking it a bit. But if I was dealing with this myself and did not want to have these issues, by the way, you can disable the proportional editing with the O key. So O turns that on and off. All right, the way I would solve that is I would go select linked, move that out of there, hit double A, Control, drag, grab this, hit the O key for proportional editing back on, hit the S key to scale it, and then I would actually make the scaling range much bigger, like that. Then I'd come back over here, click that with the right mouse button, hit the L key, and then hit the G key to go back here. And now we just moved it out of the way so it wasn't affected by the proportional editing tool. So now you might say, well, okay, but is there a better way? I don't want to always have to be moving things around like that. Well, it turns out there is a better way. You'll notice if I change the scale of this with the S key now, it's influencing everything again. However, there's a little secret in the proportional editing tool, which is you've got a choice. You can enable or disable it by hitting the O key, but within this tool, you've got two ways that it works. Projected 2D and connected. The default is projected 2D, which is what we've been seeing. If you switch it to connected, then the proportional editing tool will only affect strokes that are connected to the one that we grabbed. So that's another way to solve the same problem. In this case, we would hit Control, drag a lasso around this, and now you see that we can do the proportional editing tool and not have it affect the eye. Okay? So I show that because you will find this to be a very useful tool. And anytime you want, you can hit Z to undo. Okay. So now I'm going to go back into drawing mode. Actually, I'll show you object mode. You're not going to really probably jump into object mode a lot, but if you did jump into object mode, then it basically treats the whole grease pencil object as a single thing that you can, again, hit the G key to move, rotate, or scale. And the only time I jump into object mode really is if I'm creating a character and maybe relative to the entire scene I realize that it sort of needs to be resized. You know, maybe this is more like the positioning I wanted him to have in the scene. So I might jump into object mode for that. But most of the time I'm going to either be in edit mode or in draw mode. So now as you can see, you can click to draw mode here. That hitting tab, this is kind of an interesting quirk of Blender. If you hit tab, you go into edit mode, but if you hit tab again, it goes to object mode. So hitting tab over and over just toggles between them. So the question would be, is there a hotkey for jumping into draw mode? And there is. The hotkey for jumping into draw mode is Control tab. When you hit Control tab, you get this pop-up menu, which lets you switch between different modes. And the ones that are going to be the most interesting to us are going to be draw and edit, which we've already used, but then also sculpt mode. Okay. Within draw mode, the two hotkeys you want to know are Control plus tab, which gives you the ability to select between draw mode, edit mode, and sculpt mode. And then within those modes, you can hit Shift Spacebar to see a bunch of sub options. So if I'm in draw mode, I can hit Shift Spacebar, and now I can switch to the fill tool, or the arc tool, the line tool, etc., etc. Give me a few minutes. I could wrap this up pretty soon. All right, so now the guy that this video is really being done for is wanting to get on the computer. So I'll try to make this quick. Shift plus spacebar gives you the sub options, all right, such as, like I just showed you, basically these tools right here. But it's just a quicker way to be able to get to them. So now I'm going to hit Control Alt and grab this, and it's instantly deleted, as I showed you before. Okay, so now what I'll do to wrap up this lesson, because there's more things we could learn, but this actually gets you productive pretty quick. We want to do really two things. We want to, first of all, give the guy an eyeball. But then what we want to do is fill him and give him some shadows. So the first thing we'll do is fill him. let's jump to the fill layer, grab the fill tool, and then let's turn him green. Okay? Basically, it works pretty well. If we didn't want him to be green, we might say, well, he really should be flesh tone, so that's fine. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to color his eyes red. And then, because I can change the colors after the fact, then I'll go down to this red color and just turn it to pretty close to white. Okay? Now, if you wanted it to be exactly white, a little secret is you can always hit this little eyedropper. And anywhere in the Blender interface that you click, it's going to pick up the color. So now if I click here in the white space, it's going to make it a proper white color. Okay? So then the next thing we want to do is add shadows. You'll notice that the fills are under the ink layer. And Blender does respect the other layers when it does its fills. That's one reason why you want your sketch layer to be turned off. Because if I did a fill now, it would look, it would do that, which Krita does the same thing. So you're used to that. So the final thing would be, well, if I want to put some shadows on my character, I have this material, which is a shadow filled material, which has a fill characteristic but not a stroke characteristic. It's only going to draw the fill, and the fill is set to only 15% opacity. Okay? So if I do it in the shadow layer where the clamping option is selected, I can grab, I don't want to fill it. If I fill it, it's just going to, it just filled it with a very transparent black, so it darkened his skin. That's not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do is draw the shadow. So I'm going to grab my draw tool. I'm going to leave it on draw ink because I want that smoothing. And now let's just go ahead and go through here and add shadows wherever we want. Like so. So we can draw it around like this. And as you can see, everywhere outside of our character, that color disappears, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay? So this set of tools gets you started with Blender. You certainly have the ability to create interesting characters this way. The thing you want to remember is just know what tools you're dealing with and then what layers you're working on. It's really easy to accidentally be, you know, carrying on and to realize that you just started drawing shadows in the ink layer, or you know, or more likely the sketch layer, that sort of thing. You do want to be aware of where you're putting things. So that's really about it. The only other thing I would add is that if you go in your timeline to another frame, okay, and I'll just stay in the ink layer. If I start drawing like so, the reason this just went dark is because when I started drawing, and actually I want to use my ink. I'm in the ink layer. I want my ink material. Okay. Okay. This guy went semi-transparent only because onion skins are on. So onion skinning shows the previous keyframe. Okay. So if I turn this off right here, onion skinning, for these two layers, then I will not see the previous frames. Now I do see the fill only because this layer doesn't have a keyframe yet. So I'm going to go to the fill layer and just draw a dot. And what that did was it created a keyframe, and so now I can't see it. If I turn onion skinning back on, I can see those previous frames. I frankly don't use onion skinning much. I find it to be more trouble than it's worth. But by basically going to a forward frame, you can go ahead and now you're creating animation. If you wanted to modify this guy, say with the proportional editing tool, this would be a highly likely thing that would happen. Is you say I want to edit this guy on a later frame. So you might go to, let's go 2 frames forward. We drop into edit mode. The proportional editing tool is on. It's in projected 2D mode, so it's going to affect all layers, not just what I select. So now if I grab this and direct, actually I want to select it and I want to hit the G key so that I can roll forward with my mouse. Okay. So now and I can hit the up and down arrows to jump from the previous keyframe to the next keyframe. So now if we take that and then I go into my ink layer, and I need to get back out of edit mode, so I'm hitting Control Tab. Want to be in draw mode, and I'm going to make a little modification to his mouth, and now with the up and down arrows I can toggle between like this. Okay, so that's it for now. That's a good introduction to cartooning and very little animation, but the basics of animation with Blender, and then we'll let you experiment with it and figure out what you don't yet understand, and then we'll deal with that as we bump into it.